Though a handful of schools have already reopened for in-person learning, the majority have not. Earlier this week, Governor Gavin Newsom and legislative leaders announced a new deal to try and help grease the wheels on that front. More now from Laurel Rosenhall of CalMatters. Laurel, it's great to have you back with us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Now, I want to talk very soon about the deal that was reached and announced this week, but I think it might be good here to get a little bit of context. There has been, as you write, months of negotiations as politicians all throughout the state have faced a lot of pressure from their parent constituents back at home. Kind of give us a sense of how long the back and forth has been going on for and what have been some of the main points of contention.
Governor Newsom came out with this budget plan at the end of December that he said would help reopen schools. And there's been, basically negotiations ongoing since then. So it's been a couple months. And a major sticking point has been the amount of requirements that would come from the state versus the amount of flexibility that local school districts would have. Obviously, schools are, locally controlled, and yet a lot of school districts wanted guidance from the state. So there was a lot of tension over that. One of the big areas was around vaccines for teachers.
Yeah, and they finally reached this deal. And just on that vaccines for teacher front, right, the CDC making recommendations that no, you don't necessarily need to have all teachers vaccinated to reopen to in-person learning. So summarize for us, I know that there was a lot in this big announcement. We just saw Governor Gavin Newsom there earlier this week in Elk Grove. But what are some of the key points in terms of the deal that they reached?
Well, on the issue of teacher vaccination, the deal basically makes it more likely that teachers can get vaccinated before they return to the classroom because it puts in law this plan that the governor put in place already, which was setting aside 10% of the state's vaccine allotments for educators and creating some dedicated days at the mass vac sites in LA and Oakland that are specifically for educators. So it's going to make it easier for teachers to get vaccines, and they were largely satisfied with that. But it does not go so far as to require that teachers be vaccinated before they go back to school. That was something that teachers originally asked for, that they and the governor said, no, that would slow things down for districts that have already opened, like the one in your report that you just showed. They probably reopened before they figured that out. And many districts around the state, mostly small ones, but they have figured out agreements and they haven't required vaccines. So Newsom didn't want to roll back the progress in places that have been able to make it.
Yeah. So, Laurel, there is money on the line here for schools who are able to meet, certain requirements in terms of reopening. Can you break down for us how much money is available and what these schools need to do in order to get their hands on that grant funding?
Yeah, so it's important for everyone to understand that this deal does not require that any schools reopen. Again, that is a local decision that your local school board is going to make. But what it does is it basically dangles $2 billion as an incentive for districts, that districts would get a piece of that $2 billion if they reopen following certain conditions. So the state wants to see districts reopening for grades preschool through grade 2 by April 1st. So by the end of this month, if they want to get a share of that money. And then at the older grades, that's dependent on counties hitting the so-called red tier for coronavirus transmission. And at that point, schools would have to have one grade of middle or high school returning to in-person instruction in order to get the money.
Yeah, and there is also the requirement, there's so much to keep track of here, because of course there are some families who say, no, I'm not ready for my kid to go back to in-person learning. So there's also a requirement for, even when schools do reopen, to allow that distance learning to continue. I know part of the issue here, and the governor and many of the legislators have said that you have to really make sure that equity is an important part of that. And based on your reporting, I see that there are some moves baked in here to make sure that certain communities have their educational goals met too. Can you tell us a little bit more about those efforts?
Well, the deal also includes $4.6 billion, which is to address what they call learning loss. So that would be money for schools to, lengthen their school year or add on summer school or provide extra tutoring or mental health services. And then another thing to keep in mind is that the the $2 billion pot of money does require that school districts bring back some of the most vulnerable students, including those who are in foster care or homeless or English language learners. And so there really is an emphasis on getting the neediest students back in the classroom soonest.
Laurel, in an ideal world, this entire conversation would be just about education and health and safety. But as you well know, politics also plays a huge role in all of this. What's kind of been the response to the deal that was announced, especially from these two key camps, parents and teachers?
So teachers have had a mixed response. The state level teachers unions seem to be okay with it, but not thrilled. You know, they didn't really get as much as they hoped for in the way of statewide safety standards. On the other hand, they did get more assurance on the vaccines, and they also got to preserve local control, which is really important to them. But we're not seeing that teachers, you know, across all of California are happy with it. And I'm sure your audience in Los Angeles knows that the Los Angeles Teachers Union has been one of the most outspoken against this, saying that this plan, you know, will propagate structural racism because it gives money to the districts that can figure out how to reopen, and it doesn't give the money to the districts that can't. So the mixed review from the teachers. And, you know, parents, there have been parents who are fighting for reopening the schools and aggressively, you know, marching in the streets, demanding that schools reopen. They're not satisfied with this plan. That doesn't mean that all parents in California are not satisfied, but those vocal parents who are taking to the streets on this issue say that this plan is a failure because it does not mandate anyone reopen the schools. And the return to in-person instruction can be quite minimal and still meet the requirements of this. So no one should expect that, you know, by April 1st, their kids are going to be back in school 5 days a week. Highly unlikely.
Highly unlikely indeed. Laurel Rosenhall of CalMatters, always great speaking with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.